Okay, thank you all for coming back with the last round of caffeination, and you ready to pay attention to a wonderful panel here. I personally get really excited about data. I'm not sure about you. Whether or not we get excited about it, we all benefit from having good data and from having good implementation science in this field, and it's desperately needed. And so I'm personally and professionally grateful to the two folks up here with me who are really making tremendous strides in that space to make sure that this type of work is driven by solid evidence. And so with us today we have Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzik, a field-wide leader with extensive research and peacebuilding expertise, who's published several groundbreaking reports, and I can vouch for them being groundbreaking. Not just one of those people that says it's groundbreaking, it truly is, that have bridged the gap between organizational relevant research and sector-wide learning. She works on improving capacity and understanding within the field of peacebuilding, on monitoring, evaluation, and impact tools and analysis in conflict-affected settings. And Sarah Cook, the director of the Security and Extremism Research Program. Her primary research interests include targeted violence, domestic terrorism prevention, hate crimes, radicalization, and victimization. She has extensive experience in evaluating dozens of domestic terrorism prevention programs as part of the Department of Homeland Security Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grantee Evaluation Project. Ms. Cook specializes in qualitative research and is adept at cognitive interviewing, qualitative interviews, focus groups, user experience testing, all of the types of data collection that seem to exist under the sun here. After joining RTI in 2007, she began her career as a survey methodologist with an emphasis on questionnaire development, survey design, question testing, and usability. So throughout her career, she's held leadership roles on projects funded by DHS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Bureau of Justice Assistance, National Institute of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and Bureau of the Census. So a data queen she is. So we have some fantastic conversation here about data and the state of the data in this field, particularly on R&R programs, and more expansively problematizing the notion of R&R as a specific field. So we'll turn over to Jessie first.
Well, thank you so much for such a gracious introduction, and thank you for putting the slides up. I know everyone stuck around for the data conversation, not necessarily the happy hour, but I'll take either. I just wanted to kick off and really acknowledge all the hard work, the long-term commitment, and the fact that this type of work is hyper-localized. And when it comes to monitor evaluation and research, that makes things very complex on trying to understand what trends we're seeing in the field, how we can take something that is so individualized and consider how to make effective policies to support those types of processes globally. And I would just start by saying that part of that comes from, I think, being more comfortable in some of the ambiguity of what it means from an individual level to a broader level. And that is not an easy answer to give policymakers or researchers. We want quick fixes. So I'll start off by putting the bad news first and just saying that these are really complex problems and there are no magic program that's gonna address them. But I do wanna start very positively and say, we have seen huge advances, and we've heard that a couple times today in the field of going from, I think, what was a general kind of wall of I have no idea what this is or what this looks like, beyond maybe theoretical questions to what are we actually doing in practice. So I'm going to focus today on thinking about where we go from evidence to practice and what we're learning right now in terms of taking stock on PCVE efforts globally. I'm going to try and use this. So I just wanted to start and say, realistically, when I first joined AFP about 6 years ago, we tried to do a kind of scoping of PCVE programs at the time, starting in 2018. We had less than 20 studies at that point in time. And I can remember that was groundbreaking. People were shocked we had found 20 studies to talk about, and hosting a series of roundtables to kind of thinking about where we are today. And not only am I going to, and I've kind of made some modifications to this presentation following the conversations we've heard today, but also thinking about some of what we're learning that's new, some of which I think is really exciting is confirming a lot more of these things that we're seeing in individualized cases more globally, which I think is really, really exciting. So today I'm going to speak about some findings from a new systematic mixed method review that we've been carrying out in coordination on global findings of PCVE programming. I'm also going to disappoint by saying we excluded the United States. And I'm going to hand that component of the research over to my lovely colleague here for a lot of intentional reasons that I think many of you will understand on why we think programming in the U.S. has different implications, different types of programming structures, and inherently a different evidence base. But I still think that what I'm going to present on today, especially after sitting through these fabulous conversations with incredible experts, not only resonates but informs and should work in synergy on promoting what we do in the U.S., what we do in Europe, what we do in Kazakhstan, and considering how those things speak to each other. So first, I just wanted to open up with this question of, what is evidence? This is a question we've been kind of struggling with for a few years, trying to understand for peace building, the peace building field, what does it mean to have an evidence-informed program? What is the necessary and sufficient evidence base to say, this is something we can do, we know how to do, we can replicate, and it's going to apply or work everywhere? Where those standards lie and for whom are super important when we think about this field, especially peacebuilding, I think PCV globally, where we know that this is still, in many phases, a nascent field. We're still learning. We don't have the advantage of, decades of health research to know exactly how much, whatever it may be I'm going to give you is going to lead to this result. We don't have that type of luxury. So we're still trying to not only identify the right questions to ask, but start to evaluate them. This research that we've been carrying out for a while, I think one of the things I just want to highlight from it for our field is certainly this question around what evidence-informed or evidence means for different stakeholders. What does it mean for a policymaker to create policy? What's enough for them to generate legislative policy compared to actually put money behind something? What's the difference for a practitioner in terms of what's enough for me to know I should integrate this into my program compared to a funder or a researcher? And I think one of the things to note is obviously all of them have very different perceptions of this. And I think one of the difficulties we do have when we talk about data or evidence-informed programming is what we mean by that. Only thing that I'll highlight from this research I think is really fun, maybe I shouldn't say fun. One of the big findings we found from policymakers was basically they're looking for anything that's more than the flip of a coin. That's sufficient evidence for them to say, I can make a policy on that, which I would say is highly different from a researcher who wants to have their 99% competency level and make sure that this is generally replicable in every situation before they're going to put their name behind it. And we see the others in the field kind of somewhere in between. So that led us to kind of the research we're doing now in terms of understanding and coordinating with the laser pulse mechanism. It's a 5-year program that's works with USAID's ITR hub. We're partnering with the CVP office as part of CPS to assist in their armed conflict and violence prevention learning agenda. And AFP has been tasked with understanding PCVE writ large, which I think definitely when we went into it, we're like, oh, yeah, we can do this. And then as we started to kind of break it apart, realize, oh, we're really focused on what I'm going to call DDRR today. That's only one of a large continuum of the radicalization spectrum and what it means to try and understand evidence there. So just to give you, before I keep you on this screen, before you get freaked out by the research approach, but one of the things just to give you a little bit of an idea on kind of how we approach the concept of collecting research and what evidence means to us, because we're very focused on collecting evidence that can inform practice. How do we improve our programs and be comfortable with some of these uncertainties so that we're at least not allowing perfect to be the enemy of the good, but also not continuing practices that we're seeing are ineffective around the field. It's really difficult to take a lot of evidence in and to figure out what it means. Even if you're trained in that, it's overwhelming. It's like drinking from a fire hose these days when it comes to the amount of data that's processed through programs. I say that after coming off this project, reading hundreds of evaluations, and still feeling at moments like I either one, know exactly what I need to say, and at the other, oh, no, this was contradicted here. I don't know how to process that myself. So our approach really looks at evidence more broadly to allow us to take mixed methods programs that normally would not affect the same level of quality that a lot of systematic reviews would do, things like an RCT or quasi-experimental. We understand that those generate very good evidence, but that doesn't mean that other types of studies aren't generating critical evidence and findings that should be informing practices now. So we really open this up to allow us to kind of more cohesively define evidence and use that to inform practice. We do this through a theory of change approach, which I can't tell you how excited I am to hear so many individuals say theory of change today. I'll try not to geek out too much in the course of this conversation, but really brought a big smile to my face. And part of that is because again, unlike other fields, we don't have a very strong, what I would say, ontological approach or a very strong intervention-based approach in PCVE. We haven't really defined what these different approaches are very well, and often that's because they're trying to do a lot of things at once. Maybe intentionally and for good purpose. We maybe can't do, as we just saw from the last program, these kind of 5 Rs. Maybe we shouldn't be doing them separately, but maybe we should. And I think those are really important questions in research that we're trying to understand and why research can be very helpful. Part of this allows us to not only improve practice, but to also think about how the field is maturing, as well as understand where there's gaps in the field of research. Really think about things that are working or not. Again, being comfortable a little bit with what that means in different contexts. And then really establishing kind of opportunities for future research. So I'm going to give you a couple of numbers here, and I promise you we won't go too long. First of all, just to give you a quick idea in terms of what we looked at. So in our initial scraping and trying to understand PCVE writ large, from prevention all the way through to reintegration, we ended up pulling around 2,300 articles, which I think is spectacular after 20, like I said, in 2018. Really, of course, we have to review those. We go through all that fun research stuff. In the end, though, because we were looking at pure evaluations, we wanted an evaluation of a program. We don't care about theory, even though we're going to put them into theories of change. We want to know what people are doing in practice. When they say they're doing this, what does that actually look like? So in the end, we pulled 129 evaluations that covered 131 different programs across the field of PCVE. So we're going to focus today on the very far right column of what I'm calling DDRR. Definitions matter, but I don't want us to get too caught up in definitions. I will say that when we started this, we anticipated that disengagement and deradicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration were going to be separate reviews. In theory, this is how we were seeing these things discussed. In practice, they were kind of all happening together or with very little boundaries across them. So we grouped them all together. The one thing I want you to note from here, though, that is really important, only 25 of our studies looked at DDRR. So this is certainly our least in terms of, right now, evidence that we're finding compared to things like prevention or what we call CI. So those are more containment, indictment, more national policies, government, policing, things like that. Very much focused more on the PVE, prevention, or some of the CVE, compared to DDRR, which is what we're focused on today. I think just in terms of trends, I just wanted to highlight, we are seeing a huge progression in research across all these fields, which I think is hugely beneficial for the field. The DDRR ones are in gray. I'm sorry if that's a little difficult to read. And then I also wanted to just show you, interesting. I'm not seeing a, do you see a map?
Nope.
How intriguing. I see a map. A little bit of a map on where these studies are coming from, but I can tell you that the largest countries that are being represented in terms of repeat studies, we see a lot coming out of Australia, which I think is probably no surprise to people here, a lot coming out of Niger and Nigeria. We do see a lot in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then also in the Philippines and Indonesia. So my useless picture there. So what we did is we tried to create these broader theories of change for the field, to understand what are DDR programs in practice doing and how does that relate to theory. You'll see that we did try and distinguish some of these because some do they do distinguish between things like when we're working on disengagement and deradicalization and how that may be different from a program that's then processing into, say, reintegration. These are very, very broad, and I'm happy to share this research. It's forthcoming, but happy to talk about theories of change. I'm blue in the face with all of you. But really, I think none of these will be too surprising. Case management, things in working on complex and pluralistic worldviews, how we transform identity, mental health and psychosocial support programming, often in combination with a lot of other types of programming, building or rebuilding relationships with family or community, livelihoods and economic opportunities, and then broader community programming looking to address fears and stigmas. Again, all this I think I've heard from different speakers today, which is very reassuring to me in terms of we're capturing a broad base of which you all are seeing as experts as well. I will just highlight that these theory chains are super interconnected in the kind of blue or PV The gray is containment addiction, and the kind of orangish red are the DDRR. So it just shows, again, we're not really distinguishing all the time quite yet in the field, but I think DDRR does often happen very separately. Okay, it's a big graphic. Don't panic. The only thing I want you to look at on here is all of those lines are going up, which is a huge, for me, positive trend showing these depict across all of our studies in DDRR. We're looking at both the strength of the evidence as determined by a multiple index, as well as the quality. And I think this is really reassuring, unlike in prevention and unlike in containment interdiction. In DDRR, we're seeing those things go together, which is a positive growth in terms of the evidence base for us, that we are not only focused on developing evidence, but we are also focused on doing it in a high quality way. So a couple of things I wanted to call out. And I want to, I have about 5 more minutes, so I want to make sure to respect my time. What we're seeing, and I want to be very careful in saying evidence-informed. Evidence-informed can be positive evidence that this is working. It can be negative evidence that things maybe didn't go as we had planned. It can be mixed evidence. Some things went up and other things went down. This is demonstrating exclusively that we have stronger, evaluative, rigorous evidence to show something's going on in these programs. So particularly case management, curriculum-based approaches, which I think I just spelled wrong, things like more planned DD programs, so we could have like a custodial setting. Definitely integrative complexity, which I heard from, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, which was exciting to me, thinking about these types of trainings to increase the way we think about or hold value so it's not an us versus them mentality. Things around custodial prison-based programs for rehabilitation, and then also some findings, again mixed, in terms of how we can use counter-alternative narratives when it comes to reintegration issues, particularly for addressing stigmatization or questions around victimization. The other thing that I want to point out that we highlight, not just evidence-informed, are things like promising practices, things we're seeing replicated findings, often highly anecdotal, but across different contexts and in different situations with different groups, which to us signifies something's happening there. These need more evaluation. But we certainly are seeing a lot in relation to religious and peer education. We heard about that from Heidi earlier. Questions around narratives and mass media usage. These questions around collaboration with families, with religious actors, with community leaders, how we harness those social networks, those pro-social opportunities to work in terms of DD. And then also things around capacity building, mentorship, but also the addition of this component of capital inputs. When we're thinking about, and I think Mike, you were talking about that earlier, we're thinking about dealing with material safety and allowing people to have opportunities in their environment. It's not just about training them. What do they do with those skills? How do they find a job? How do they take care of their basic needs while also trying to address skills building or jobs work? So just to highlight a few quick practices and evidence we're seeing, definitely around case management, we're seeing a lot around prolonged and frequent engagements. These are really important. How we engage, how long we engage, when we engage with them, that has implications on the impact long term. We also see around integrative complexity, this idea that if you are getting more appreciation for different perspectives or having more diverse worldviews, the problem with this, though, is that this takes a lot of time. All of these things take a lot of time. And also probably need a lot more resources than just let me build your capacity in a one-off training. Custodial and prisonal programs, we're seeing a lot of successes around physical disengagement as well as cognitive transformation. You can't have one without the other necessarily. And we heard about that in settings here, something like where maybe you're not actually getting that physical disengagement from extremist propaganda. What does that mean even if you're cognitively transforming? Whereas often in custodial prison settings, we have a forced separation, but we all know here how difficult those settings can be in terms of radicalization themselves. We also see this idea around pro-social behaviors, being able to develop new social circles. Again, thinking about how to sever those ties. I think how you mentioned that earlier, a huge issue though is when people go back to those social networks, they themselves can sometimes be a risk-based environment where they could also be contributing to radicalization. I heard earlier, and I was really excited to see this, the need for support from parole and social workers in post-incarceration settings is shown up a lot as a very important area to take advantage of. And then also these questions of how you can use counter-narratives through things like edutainment or radio programming to address some of these stigmatization and fears in community. Some quick challenges I'll just point out. These are small groups. We obviously heard earlier, these are smaller occurrences. When it comes to research, that's hard. That's hard to evaluate, that's hard to understand trends. There's difficulty in creating comparison groups. I can't just say, well, you're an extremist today and you might be an extremist tomorrow, so I'm going to compare you. That's not a great approach for many reasons. The replicability of this highly tailored work. Earlier I had this question about attitudes and behaviors. Well, what comes first? If we change your attitude, will your behaviors follow? If we force you behaviorally to do things where your attitudes, this is a question not just in this field, across the field. Cycles of success and failure. This idea that these programs take a long time and people often are on a trend where they step forward, they step back. They step forward more, they step back less. What does that mean in terms of success? These concepts of nested programs and evaluation, and then accounts from impacts of other programming. We know there are positive opportunities, like situations of good governance, that can heighten other program opportunities. But in the instance of, say, a bad governing situation, it could have inverse effects. So how do you use those opportunities when they're ripe to take advantage and kind of progress? And how do you also recognize when they might not be right in an environment? I'm not going to go through all these. Happy to talk with you all about recommendations, but I definitely want to highlight that the question of strategically layering and sequencing these multidisciplinary programs, I hear this all the time. However, I will say in practice, there's very little evidence to support how this works, because I think the most important thing is that this cannot be an add-on to another program, which is what we see happen a lot. Policymakers, I'll give you very quickly. We need more resources, of course. We also need to integrate it, though, into other strategies. We need integration across other fields. We need active involvement of local communities, and we need to partner with practitioners. We heard that earlier today, which I think is really critical. For Mel, and this is where I'll close, we need more theories of change, minimally program logic. It's really complicated to read a program report evaluation that's 150 pages and it looks really, really great, but I actually have no idea what you thought you would do or why that happened or what even maybe happened. Really, so moving beyond those questions of process and accountability is the only things we're evaluating. I get it, they're easy to evaluate. I do it myself. But when we actually want to get to concrete evidence, we need more work. Integrating researchers from the beginning. These are hard things and you're not expected to know how to do them as a practitioner or a funder, and then really thinking about innovative measures. And I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, everybody take a deep breath after that.
Okay,
That
I
was
will.
beautiful and wonderful, and thank you, Jessica. Just moving on to now the context that brings us all together, seeing how this shows up or doesn't show up in the United States.
Yeah, so I will go ahead and start talking while my presentation comes up because I am aware that I am now the last thing between you and the cocktail reception. So I'm going to start just sort of talking, I'm going to talk about two different programs that I've evaluated. As you heard, I've done a number of evaluations for DHS and the Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, as well as the Countering Violent Extremism Grant Program, which only had one cycle in fiscal year 2016. But I want to start with a little bit of a story for that program that we evaluated from the fiscal year 16 cohort. One of the things we do on these evaluations is we do site visits. So we were at a site visit, and they were implementing a program in a jail, and it was a mindfulness program. And so we were able to go in and see part of the program and talk with some of the inmates. And so we went in there, and there was an inmate actually kind of leading a meditation session with his peers. And as once he kind of finished up, the facilitators who we've been talking to for months shared with us, this is not the same person that came in here months ago when he first came in, went through it, the whole program, and graduated from it. They're like, this is not the same person. And he kind of, was just sort of humbly kind of like nodding, like, yeah, I was different. And another guy in the group said, I watched him change. He used to be very, very angry, and I saw him change, and I wanted that for myself. That's why I signed up for this cohort. So to me, I just got chills thinking about it. That's just a very kind of impactful story to talk about what some of these programs could be doing. But unfortunately, anecdotes like that, as wonderful as they are, aren't what's going to get things moving forward. We need more. We need more data. Is this the first time you've heard that today? Just checking. Okay, so the two projects that I'm going to talk about, one that I just referenced is the Alameda County Sheriff's Office from the fiscal year 16 CVE grant program. They were doing a mindfulness training in jails, in a jail in California. And then the Counter Extremism Project. One of the great things about going last is that half of my presentation's already been said today. So I'm going to gloss over the CEP program a little bit because Hunkal did a really good job of describing it earlier, but essentially they were a fiscal year 20 grantee for the DHS TVTP grant program, and their alternative pathways curriculum and training was intended to be implemented in prisons as well as virtually through a correspondence course. So both of these grantees had more to it than just these incarcerated individual interactions. But for these purposes, I'm just going to focus on these two things. Okay, so for Alameda County, they had MBA, the Mind Body Awareness Mindfulness Training. It was an evidence-based cognitive behavioral intervention. Some of the aspects of it, it was a 10-week series, ironically 10 weeks, same as CEP, a series of modules. They had both group and individual sessions planned so that the inmates would have a group session, but then they'd also have one-on-ones with the facilitators. As I referenced, there's a meditative component, so they did more than just talk about the curriculum. They also introduced and taught them how to meditate. They meditated as a group as well as encouraged them to meditate on their own. And then they also had peer mentors. And what peer mentors were and did basically was if they graduated from the training, completed the course, then they were, some of them were invited to come back and help lead the next cohort. They were also asked to help recruit people, inmates to join, because who are you going to listen to more, your fellow inmate who said this thing is really great, or someone who is just coming in and says, hey, I've got this program, come do it. So the outputs that we have are those two bullets, essentially. So the Alameda County Sheriff's Office, they enrolled 105 inmates in this MBA program over 6 different cohorts. 66, which is 63% of the inmates, actually graduated, which they had a graduation ceremony. This is not unexpected, an unexpected number. They expected attrition. One, because this is a jail, transfers happen, people get moved. Some people got released. There's also, this is kind of an intensive, self-monitoring, introspective type of program. And so they acknowledged even before they started doing this that people will sign up, but they will need to drop out. They are not necessarily in a place to do this. And especially because of the group setting, they encourage people who were there, if you don't feel like you can do this or this isn't right for you right now, it's okay to drop out. That's fine. And there were some people who said, hey, this just isn't for me right now. So the other program, CEP, had their alternative pathways curriculum. As you know, they had a theory of change, and they developed curriculum for a safe, healthy, and dignified rehabilitation and reintegration of violent extremists, affiliated criminal offenders in the United States. Again, Hunkal's talked about this program earlier. Many of you are familiar with it. It was based off of Parallel Networks' Control-Alt-Delete, which that is a play on delete. That's not just how we say Delhate in the South. It is how it sounds, though. So Control-Alt-Delete is about controlling the, and Hunkal, correct me if I get this wrong, but controlling the response to stimulus, altering your course to nonviolence, thinking more about reorienting to community, to purpose, meaning, and in doing so, delete hate within oneself and by proxy or by nature of the community.
Who would have said I'd be dragging you along with this since fiscal year 2020?
Right. So, so Hunkal has been part of our, and CEP has been part of our evaluations that just ended like 2 weeks ago. So we've been working with her and talking to her monthly since 2020. So I've picked up a few things. So for their program, as I'm trying to change all the slides at one time, we had some outputs. They're not the outputs that anyone expected a couple years ago. They did their individual correspondence course, as Hankal mentioned. There were 10 individuals who enrolled and completed the training, and this was done all remotely, all virtually. And by virtual, I'm saying kind of a little old school virtual. This wasn't on Zoom necessarily. A lot of snail mail, prison mail was done. Hankal gave us a lot of stories about that, as well as she would have phone calls and emails when possible. But this was all done sort of on a one-on-one basis. And within that group of 10, there were multiple ideologies represented. So the curriculum is not ideology specific. The folks that she was able to recruit into doing this were not from a single ideology. So there were some variances there. One of the big plans, again, the spoiler alert, didn't get to happen, was the group course with the inmates, the in-person, which was that 10-week session. The outcomes, or I'm sorry, the outputs that we have for this are essentially the extreme efforts that Hankal put into trying to get this implemented into a facility. She discussed implementation with 7 prisons, and this isn't 7 prisons that she had one phone call with. These are multiple calls, multiple emails, different layers of administration, to which none of these pan out where they were able to let her in, and we're going to talk about some of these challenges in a minute. She also conversed with 21 relevant parties, and what's a relevant party? That's probation officers, judges, people from Department of Corrections, other related people who may have an interest in this curriculum and implementing it, or finding some way in which it can be useful to them. All right, so we're going to talk about the challenges. Is there a picture there?
Yes.
Okay, you can barely see. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the challenges. So, as you may have noticed from the data that I showed, there wasn't any outcomes in there. It wasn't talking about these are the huge changes that happened, because both of these grantees ended up with a lot of challenges. The first one just being implementing. And it's not even about data, just even getting implemented. So just like this guy here, we need to climb Mount implementation. And so why was it so hard? Why is it so hard to climb Mount implementation? First, again, not new today, but access to inmate populations. It's been over a year that CEP has been working, Hankal has been working to get this program in a facility. The good news is she is very persistent, and we need a lot of that in this field. And she has this has been an ongoing process. Even though the grant period of performance has ended for her, they are still having conversations and working to find ways and places where this alternative pathways curriculum can be implemented. And I know she's going to be collecting data as she does that, even though we're no longer evaluating her in part of that process. Another reason why it's difficult is just the correctional facility staffing shortages. I haven't heard of a correctional facility that says, oh, we're overstaffed, we have so many people, we don't know what to do with them. The opposite usually is true. And so that ends up being a problem, because sometimes the reason that you can't come in with your program to a facility is because, well, we don't have the staff. And what does that mean? Well, inmates have to be escorted from their cells, from rec time, from wherever they are, to come to a program. Facilitators have to be escorted once they get there, unless sometimes there's options like a brown card, which CEP, their contractor, went through and tried to do, which you go through a process where you're able to move within the facility without being escorted, but that's not always available. So another a problem that Alameda County Sheriff's Office had with their mindfulness program was they actually went to a jail that had a lot of programming. That's a good problem to have, in my opinion. But again, they only had so many staff that could escort because they already were committed to escorting folks with these other programs. So, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about mitigating some of these challenges or things that we can do. But these are things that we've seen now in 2 different programs trying to implement within correctional facilities in the United States. Another, I call it the catch-22, is that many facilities told Hong Kong, well, we don't want to do this until we know it works, or we don't want to do this until we know that inmates are going to want to do this and that they're going to be interested in it. It's like, saying, hey, we want to hire you, but you need experience first, but no one's willing to be the first one to give you experience. It's the same thing. Everyone wanted someone else to be the first to try this. So I call that the catch-22, because how do you get out of that loop? Who's going to be the one to say, okay, here, try it here? Risk assessments is something that I know Paul mentioned a little bit earlier. The group at ACSO, they were planning on doing focusing on at-risk individuals, but they realized there's no validated risk assessment, and this was, again, a few years ago, but there was nothing they felt comfortable enough with to use and sort of design their study, their implementation on at-risk based on what was currently available there. So we need to climb Mount Implementation, but there's a second mountain, actually, that we need to climb. It's Mount Data. So Mount Data, the good news is we can climb them both at the same time, kinda, but you don't have to climb them separately. So of extreme importance is baseline data. And baseline data, until AI or ChatGPT or Elon Musk or someone comes up with a time machine where we can go back in time, you have to collect that baseline data before you start implementing things. Before, yeah, right? Anything that you're going to do, any program, before you start, collect that baseline data. Not collecting baseline data is kind of like climbing this mountain in these new shoes and saying to everyone, I just climbed this really huge mountain in these new shoes. This guy, let's just say he's wearing new shoes, and he's telling everyone about them. And he's like, how big? And they're like, well, how high did you climb? Oh, it was really high. Okay, well, how far did you go? Really, really far. Okay, well, can I ascend 18,000 feet in these? Or can I climb Everest in these? Is that going to work based on your experience? Well, if you never measure where you started and where you ended up, you can't actually say. We can say, no, I think you can, it's really far, but there's no data. So that's why we need baseline data to see where we're starting from, and then at the end, where did we end up? You can collect more data than that. This is just sort of the bare minimum that I'm throwing out there. So here's some possible solutions. These all have limitations. I'm just going to say that now. But how can we get past this? How can we climb Mount Implementation and Mount Data at the same time? One is to find alternative yet related populations for pilot testing. So, for example, if you can't get an at-risk population, can you get an incarcerated population? So ACSO, like I said, they wanted to do at-risk and they realized they couldn't do that. It took them a long time to implement because they had trouble getting in the facility. What they were able to do is they were offered the protective custody population. Because they're in protective custody, and I think Bryant mentioned this earlier, they don't have access to the other programs. All of the other programs that staff were busy with at this jail, these folks, because they were in protective custody, couldn't be part of that. So they were actually hungry and starving for some type of programming in their group. So, this is not the violent extremist at-risk group they expected. These are people who were likely sex offenders, child abusers. They're leaving gangs. They're maybe leaving an extremist group, but somewhere there it's not safe for them in the general population. So, thank you. And then The other thing is consider piloting with probationers, especially if they were recently released. They're easier to access. They know what it's like to be in prison. A week or two ago, they were in prison. They were your population that you're looking for. So that's just another option. Again, there are limitations to this, but it's something that we can do so that we can get some data in order to move forward with that target population. So I'm going to I've got my contact information there. The last thing I'm going to say, just because there's a microphone in front of my face, is that if you implement any kind of programming, please, please, please collect data before and after. We need data on these programs, whether you're implementing a program, whether you're doing something new. Please implement that data.
Thank you, Sarah. As we did before, I think we should give preference and precedence to the folks online who might have some questions. Just a friendly reminder for those online, the chat function isn't working, so please use the Q&A function. And for those in the room, your hand is your Q&A function. So.
Are we at that point of the day? We just holler.
All right, thank you. So this is for either of the presenters. In the evidence-informed approaches, is there evidence both on what works in isolation, but what works in combination, in what sequence, in what timing periods, and in what emphasis?
Cool.
Does that? Happy to repeat that.
Yeah, no. Well, one thing I can tell you in those very busy scatter plots, we did isolate programs that were operating under a single theory of change compared to programs that were working in a combinatorics type approach to try and kind of test a question in that regard in terms of if they are having a very focused approach, are we seeing higher quality, stronger evidence or not? In some cases, I will say that did hold true, particularly around prevention and counter and alternative narratives. In terms of DDRR, the simple fact is most of these programs are hyper integrated, so our ability to say, combination versus isolation beyond saying, perhaps, I reiterate again, these things should happen in combination. I'm not an expert in terms of implementation practice there, but I think that that's a really critical question. In terms of sequencing, this is another major issue and why we ended up combining, at least in our research, the theories of change, because many of them did not make any overt or explicit explanation on sequencing. Was disengagement and deradicalization best occurring pre-release in a carceral setting? Is it a process that should be happening in tandem with, say, reintegration efforts? One of the things that struck me earlier in the 5R was rehabilitation was shown following after reintegration, which was happening first. Those are critical questions that I would say until we better understand, I would say, definitional boundaries of what those are, the sequencing will remain a broad question. And then the question of where to emphasize in terms of where we put emphasis across them, I think probably the biggest takeaway, and I hate to say this because as a researcher I know how complicated it is all of these aspects are very important. I think that Mike and our colleagues earlier shared, we used to say this when I worked more in development, I can't teach a woman about female empowerment if her children are starving. It's very difficult to engage in those conversations if someone is unable to find a job and is homeless. I can, try and work with them on ideological disengagement or deradicalization, but they have a lot of other pressing concerns too. So I think that there's a need to balance, just as we were hearing earlier from trauma, how you emphasize or connect those programs. But I think ignoring critical needs, particularly for your own agenda or prioritization of what a person's needs are at that moment in time, is probably the most negative approach you could take. I'll leave it there. If you have any comments.
No, I think that was good.
We have one more here, if that's okay. So we heard earlier that often, quote, measures of effectiveness, unquote, are limited to security incidents. What level of data do policyholders need to see before agreeing to pilot or implement?
That's a really great question. I don't think there's a set, this is what you need. I don't think there's one bar. And Hung Call, I know you've talked to a lot of them, so feel free to chime in with the microphone if you want to. But
No, my turn.
no. But there's different concerns in different facilities with different people. They want to see they're willing to take different levels of risk. So it depends really on who you're talking to, what your program is, what you're trying to do, and what you tell them is going to be the outcome of your program. Because we do this, blank is going to happen. So if you say that you are going to, I'm trying to come up with a non-realistic idea, but I'm not. If you're going to stop all terrorism, they're going to want to see, okay, what data, how do we know that's going to happen? What data do you have to show that? So it's really kind of a case-by-case basis is my experience.
Yeah, and I would just flag in terms of, I don't think we are limited to security measures. I think there's been a lot of advancements, and we'll be issuing a kind of briefer in relation to trends in measurement. Anyone who's engaged with me previously knows I am an indicator fiend. AFP hosts the Irene Peacebuilding Indicator Database, and we are obsessed with knowing how people measure change or consider change or perceive success in different scenarios across peacebuilding. And I will say, just as one single example, a couple of the case management studies coming out of Australia have developed really interesting scales contextually relevant to their programs, but attempting to assess progress, what progress looks like on an individual level for individuals going through a tailored case management approach. So I think that that's a good indication that there are more than just, number of recidivism rate, which also is terrible because almost everyone collects it after they really are released from prison, which is interesting in of itself. But I think there's a lot of advances. It's hard, again, it's like drinking from a fire hose. Even if you have time reading all of those, figuring those out. And that's where people like Sarah and I come in to help as well. And then the other thing I would just note, and I think you were hitting upon this in terms of level of risk, I think the field for many years has done a disservice to ourselves by promising the world, I can deliver this across this population without realistically setting good boundaries or expectations on what that looks like. So I think all of us also being more realistic on what measures of success look like for this field and asking that question, because the important question is really, what is the question? And my methodologist next to me would certainly agree with that. Is highly contextualized, but that doesn't mean that it's not valid. So I think us also pushing more and having those conversations with policymakers that, if we can change 5 people who come out and don't have don't return to prison, or don't commit, as that great example earlier, don't commit additional crimes that maybe wouldn't, is that enough? And I think that those are value questions in some regard, but I think that as a field we can push that forward better.
Amazing. So we have a little bit of time for a few questions from the room for those of you that have questions here. And there's, I think, a microphone that'll magically appear. Great.
Yeah.
Can I?
Hunkal, do you have a question?
Yes, but I
Okay.
don't know if I can grab the microphone or not.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the flashbacks. Sarah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't know, maybe for both, but maybe more specifically for Jessica, because I know she's on the quant side of things, and I'm very interested actually in the measuring the non-quant things. Like, for example, you were speaking earlier about the integrative complexity training. Like, how on earth do you measure something that, there's the radicalization scale, whatever, like, how is it, and how do you consider valid programs for your assessment?
Yeah, so, I would say one thing, we don't have to do this in a vacuum. And I think Heidi was presenting on really great information there in terms of there's a lot to pull from other fields, particularly psychology, psychiatry, mental health. They have made huge advances on conceptualizing and creating assessments to allow us to maybe pinpoint. I don't think it's an exact science because I don't know that humans are an exact science in our brain in some ways. I could be refuted by anyone, but I've seen enough people behave irrationally in enough situations that I question that. But I think that there are, borrowing from other fields and considering how those can be adapted to ours, I think there's been a lot of good progress there. I will say at least an integrative complexity programming, there is very specific psychological research on how to lead the program and how to evaluate it in different contexts. It has its own limitations. I would definitely, my recommendation is always, again, we don't want to just cherry pick things. A lot of these, and I think we in the peacebuilding field know this very well in terms of questions like contact theory, that just because you bring people together, that's not sufficient to lead to the changes we've seen. There are certain conditions necessary to create effective change. So I am seeing progress in that regard. I think one of the things that I'm seeing develop most in terms of quantifying qualitative data is occurring off of scales or indices, where we're attempting to really look at unique components, standardize them in a certain way, and then assess progress around those unique scales. But I do think there are opportunities, questions like, how do we better measure recidivism? And part of that is not because we don't know how. I think part of it is just we haven't done it, as Sarah was mentioning. That ends when someone leaves a probationary period, potentially. Well, does that mean that person's just all of a sudden great and good and they're never going to reoffend? Probably not. As we know, it's a lifetime process. So I think some of them are just us improving our measures and committing to doing that measurement. But others are kind of playing, maybe in a fail fast mentality as well. We try different things in different scenarios, but definitely not just doing what we've done, which is very little. So definitely measurement indicators, it's all about experience and exposure. So looking at as many as you can, seeing what works, and then contextually making them relevant in different scenarios and seeing how to collect that before you implement, very importantly, and after, I think could see huge success. And happy to share studies too.
I'll ask one. If there's are there any other questions in the room first before I offer one probably controversial question? No. I think it's important coming from the practitioner side myself, from the mental health practice side, when we've seen every RFP has this notion of we need to make sure that the programs that we select are to fund are scalable, sustainable, cost-effective, evidence-generating, all these words that we use. And, we see this interesting dynamic where there's this cycle of agencies that are power holders, whether that's through funds or through name reputation, generate evidence for their programs. Then there's an increased call for evidence-based programming. Then there's a limited supply of providers or trainers to build the capacity of any organizations that aren't those power holders that originally generated that data. And then, those larger orgs entrench those existing practices as the only evidence-based practices that exist. And we've seen this across multiple sectors. So in the era of localization, what's your advice both to smaller agencies and to the donor side to avoid these tremendous biases that often occur in the necessary push towards evidence-based programming?
I'll let you go first on that one.
Well, for the smaller organizations, what I would say is partner with a university. Find a partner who can help you evaluate if that is not your thing, help you evaluate what you're doing, help you collect data, help you plan all of that out in the beginning before you do anything at the proposal stage. Work with someone who it might make you a little bit bigger when you're partnering with someone else, and is also more enticing when you have a plan like, here, this is how we're going to collect these data. This is what the outcomes are that we're looking for. There was another part to that question, and yeah.
Well, you covered Rex of small orgs, which I think is really important, because AFP is a small organization in terms of what we do, particularly in the research parameter. We're a non-implementer, we support the field, and I think partnership is key when you're thinking about how to grow that. It can be hard to identify. I think academics can be a good opportunity. I think think tanks, other researchers. But I also think that it improves the overall practice because those different parties bring different skill sets, which are super important when we're considering this. I'll focus on the Rex to donors when it comes to power dynamics. One thing at AFP is we spend a lot of time in our research and evidence team of doing what I call donor capacity building on MEL. What does it actually mean? What should you actually expect? And what's in some cases even appropriate? The idea that we have caps on, 10% of your funding only can go to research, but this better be replicable or sustainable. So some of that, I think, is a necessity for stronger capacity building of donors and funders and policymakers on both what is feasible, and again, these questions of what's acceptable, or what, for you, I think, how can you conceptualize what you're looking for as a return on your investment? That's a hard question for us individually, but for a donor as well. And I think that they have a hard time, again, it goes back to that comment on what is your question, what is your goal or your purpose. To accompany that, though, one word of extreme caution that I think is really important is, and again, this might be a little controversial, but I do not believe in the co-designing of a grant process with a donor for the simple fact that it often takes advantage of smaller organizations who are incapable of putting forward, say, before a grant, that level of effort or that level of commitment without a guarantee that things are going to come through. So I think also thinking about ways to relieve that burden of a small organization, but keep the best practice. We want to design that in tandem, but aren't necessarily or will certainly be kind of pushed out of the field or a bidding process because we don't have those capacities. These grants are huge. They are intensive. When we were hearing earlier from DHS on best practices, I think they've done a lot of great things on trying to facilitate that, but it is a massive undertaking for a small org. So I think also thinking creatively on better ways to kind of hedge some of those risks to allow for more adaptive application processes that do allow for, as I said, co-designing in some sort of funded process would be very helpful.
All right. Another round of applause to our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much. Over to Hunkal to help us conclude this amazing day.
Just for the sake of it, you could,
We're going to leave it to you.
Oh, hooray. Yeah, thank you, the three of you, Sarah and Jessica, for presenting, Mike for moderating. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the networking event, but just a few words. And of course, I have to start with thank you. Thank you to everybody who's here today, all the panelists, also the people who are joining us online. And I think to wrap up, just some brief comments. We've discussed the design and implementations, the improvement of the design and implementation of programs in order to, we've been speaking about safe, healthy, dignified 5 Rs, across the board. But I think one of the things, at least from where I stand, that hasn't maybe, and this is very applicable to the US context, hasn't been highlighted is when should these programs start? And probably in the same way we're speaking about collecting data early on, start early on within the prison system already. Right. Another key word, cooperation. I think it's evident that law enforcement and security bodies cannot do this by themselves. And civil society organizations are essential key partner in all of this, particularly those working to promote social cohesion and development. If only for the fact that they know the context better. They know their community, they know their people, they know who to talk to. That, again, luckily today we've had the opportunity, and I'm very grateful to partners on the other side of the world for, giving us some of their insights and their experiences. So basically, on behalf of everybody at the Counter Extremism Project, thank you. Thank you again to everybody who has contributed to advancing today's conversation on what should be done, right? When talk about rehabilitation and reintegration of extremist offenders in the United States. Of course, thanks to DHS. Thank you, Ryan, in particular today. No, and David O'Leary, too, for the presentation. Hector Tejeda, who was unable to join us today, but he has been a very, very supportive program officer throughout the whole development of this project. Additionally, much appreciation again to our fantastic panelists, moderators, audience, for the very engaging questions. Thank you very much. And thank you to the rest of the CEP, Plus Communications, and the Panel Networks team. Darlene, I can't see you from behind the corner, but thank you. Darlene, Alan Goldsmith, Robert Benton, Annalisa, where are you? Abergas, thank you very much, as well as Josh Silberberg and his team, Gabby Abrams, Emily Romero, and Sierra Wilson, who've been helping us outside today with the registrations. and everybody who made this conference happen, including the National Press Club, who have made this whole process very, very easy. And thank you, Jessica, for the recommendation. Thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.